Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. The Eurovision Song Contest is one of the oldest and biggest celebrations of music in the world. Ever since it first began all the way back in 1956, creatives from nations all over the continent, and even those outside of Europe, have come together to share aspects of their culture, their inspirations, and their talents. With the 67th edition of the contest due to take place in Liverpool here in the UK this year, I thought now would be a great time to go back and look at some of the United Kingdom's history with Eurovision. There's high points, and low ones too, and many moments that you may have forgotten about along the way. This video is going to focus on the winners, those lucky few who have represented the UK at the contest and walked away the gold medalist. Despite the jokes aimed squarely at the Brits' attempts in the contest in recent years, you may be surprised to learn that when it comes to winning, we've actually done better than most. The United Kingdom has won Eurovision a grand total of 5 times, with the only countries winning more than us being Sweden at 6 and our neighbours Ireland at 7. So with 5 victories under our belt, surely you're able to recall them all, right? One or two may spring instantly to mind, but let's go back, all the way back, and delve right into the UK winners of the Eurovision Song Contest. The year is 1967, and the 12th Eurovision Song Contest took place in Vienna, Austria, on the 8th of April 1967. 17 different nations took part, all of whom had been part of the contest beforehand. The only non-returning country that year was Denmark, who wouldn't be seen again at Eurovision until 1978. This was also the last edition of the contest to be televised and transmitted in black and white exclusively. From the 1968 Eurovision onwards, the contest would be filmed and shown in colour, though several nations would continue to transmit the programme in monochrome, as different nations were able to adapt to colour television at different speeds. For the United Kingdom, our entry that year was Sandie Shaw. Born and brought up in Dagenham, Essex, the then 20-year-old was already quite the pop star by the time she was chosen to represent the UK at Eurovision. Having first burst onto the music scene in 1964, she quickly scored her first #1 in the September of that year with the song There's Always Something There to Remind Me, written by music legends Burt Bacharach and Hal David. The track would stay on the charts for 11 weeks, 3 of them at pole position. Sandie's next 4 singles all reached the top 10, amongst them another chart topper, Long Live Love, in the June of 1965. However, by the time her chance at Eurovision came about, Sandie's fortunes on the charts were slowly starting to tumble. Whilst her singles were still charting, they were peaking further and further down the top 40. Her first single of 1967, I Don't Need Anything, missed that margin altogether, only managing number 50. Sensing perhaps her time in the pop charts had ended, her manager was suggesting cabaret as a more appropriate future direction. But Sandie's luck swerved as she was invited by the BBC to represent the UK at that year's Eurovision Song Contest. With the profile of the contest these days, you'd think most artists would jump at the chance should they be asked. However, back in the 60s, it wasn't that straightforward. Eurovision back then didn't necessarily showcase lots of pop-orientated music, as it arguably does now. Many pieces from the early days are very easy to listen to, very traditional, and don't stray too far out of the box. For Sandie, who at the time was viewed as one of the most successful female British pop stars of the decade, Eurovision almost seemed like a step backwards. However, she eventually agreed, performing 5 songs on television, with the viewing public deciding which one would be our selected song. The winner of the 5 was a track called Puppet on a String, one that Sandie again had reservations about, fearing it wasn't entirely representative of either herself as an artist or of her work up to that point. But regardless, she pressed ahead and took the song to Vienna to compete in the contest, her managers perhaps hoping that her participation would redeem some of her public image. At that time, Sandie was embroiled in a scandal. She had been found out to be the other woman in an affair that she had with a married man. Whilst affairs like these happen today and don't gain half as much of the attention as they do in the press, back in the 60s it was a very different story. Various people at the BBC were disgusted that the corporation had selected her to represent the country. Whether this was a PR exercise or not, Sandie in recent years has made her then view of the contest perfectly clear. I thought the Eurovision Song Contest was crap. It wasn't even on my or my friend's radar. I'm a post-war baby, and the whole idea of countries fighting again seemed ridiculous. When the voting began for the 1967 contest, it became pretty clear early on who the potential winner was going to be. Sandie Shaw, with Puppet on a String, won Eurovision with 47 points, more than double the amount awarded to second place, which that year was Ireland, whose Sean Dunphy scored 22 points for If I Could Choose. This margin was viewed as quite the lead at the time, and not only did Sandie score her third #1 single on the charts, but she also secured the United Kingdom its very first victory at the Eurovision Song Contest. The pop approach had worked, the 60s star having captivated audiences across the continent, even becoming the best-selling single of the year in Germany, with several million copies sold in total. You'd think with such a public victory and the success on various European charts that this was the beginning of a sort of second renaissance for Sandie. Well, not exactly. Speaking in recent years, when commenting on the launch of her own fashion label in 1968, she claims she nearly lost the opportunity because the manufacturing company thought doing Eurovision was so uncool. So it seems that the reputation the contest had at the time, particularly amongst young pop-buying music listeners, was still that it was perhaps something for an older audience. While Sandie retains her popularity and her place in the history of pop music as one of the leading ladies of the 60s, her luck with the charts wouldn't bounce back. Following Puppet on a String, she only scored one more top 10 hit during the decade, that being Monsieur Dupont in early 1969. She continued to make music during the 70s and 80s, her last entry in the top 40 being a cover of The Smiths' Hand in Glove, which made number 27 in April 1984. Whether or not Eurovision helped or hindered Sandie Shaw's career, I'll let you be the judge, but make no mistake, the barefooted, swinging sensation gave the UK something it failed to achieve over the course of more than a decade. A victory at the biggest musical contest in the world. And in many ways, Sandie's win back in 1967 would begin to reshape the mould for what kind of acts the UK would send to Eurovision in the many years and decades to follow.
Like a puppet on a string.
The year is 1969, and the 14th Eurovision Song Contest took place in Madrid, Spain, on the 29th of March 1969. 16 different nations took part, all of whom had been part of the contest at some point beforehand. The only non-returning country that year was Austria, who wouldn't be seen at Eurovision again until 1971. For the United Kingdom, this year's contest was a chance at redemption. Having hosted the 1968 edition, they were hotly tipped to win for a second year in a row, with the song Congratulations, performed by Cliff Richard, who was already a huge success of an artist. As the votes came in, all seemed like it was going to plan, until Spain pipped the UK to the post by just 1 point. Marseille and her song La 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 being crowned the winner. So for 1969, the UK would once again turn to their bright young pop stars and select one that was energetic, fun, and perhaps most importantly, had an established name. Lulu is another name that has ended up becoming synonymous with the 1960s pop scene here in the UK. At the tender age of 15, her debut single from 1964 has perhaps one of the most iconic opening lines of the decade.
You know you make me wanna shout.
Shout made the top 10, peaking at number 7, and despite following it up with a slew of different singles, only a few of them were able to replicate that performance. Leave a Little Love made number 8 in 1965, and The Bow Tie Row gave Lulu a new chart peak at number 6. Ironically, her first number 1 wouldn't occur on the UK charts, but across the pond in the United States. To Sir With Love was a 1967 film starring Sidney Poitier, a trailblazing African-American actor who was at the peak of his popularity. Starring alongside him in this picture was none other than Lulu, and it only seemed apt that she'd sing the title song. To Sir With Love soared to number 1 on the Billboard charts, becoming the best-selling single of 1967 over there. So surely it was almost guaranteed to get top 10 in the UK, right? Wrong. To Sir With Love was relegated to being a B-side for another single, Let's Pretend. That song did reach number 11, but the hit movie song failed to chart in its own right back in Britain. As the years rolled on, Lulu managed to secure a few more top 20 spots, with songs such as Me, The Peaceful Heart, Boy, and I'm a Tiger. But before the swinging 60s would bow out, Eurovision came calling. As her name grew ever more common in the pop music scene, Lulu would be a frequent presence on television, both performing and presenting a whole variety of programmes. She claims it was the BBC's head of light entertainment, Bill Cotton, who suggested that she represent the UK at the Eurovision Song Contest. Like Sandie Shaw before her, Lulu had reservations. She recalls that her boss cited that she'd get good ratings as a result of her participation, and despite still being unsure, she said, "Maybe I could have said no, but I feel I really didn't have a choice in the matter." On her variety show, Happening with Lulu, the singer performed 6 different songs, all of which were contenders to be submitted for the contest in Madrid that year. Interestingly, one of these entrants, I Can't Go On, was written by none other than Elton John and his longtime collaborator, Bernie Taupin. Ironically, This song came last in the overall vote, but the duo's star would soon go stratospheric in just a couple of years' time. The song that did win was Boom Banga Bang. Ready with a tune to take to the top spot, Lulu travelled to Madrid for the 1969 Eurovision Song Contest. Performing 7th, Lulu, together with Boom Banga Bang, easily clinched the win, reaching first place with 18 points, thus the UK being declared the winners, as were Spain and France. Oh, don't forget the Netherlands too. Yes, you're hearing me right, there was a 4-way tie at the 1969 contest. Now, these days there are measures in place should there ever be a tie again, such as counting up which nations received the most 12 points, the most 10 points, and so on, so you'll only get one winner. But back in 1969, there was no tiebreaker rule in place at all. So rather than try and hash one out on the spot, as the event was being broadcast live, all 4 nations were simply declared the winners. This drew major criticism from other competing countries, many of whom would not participate in the following year's contest in 1970. Such nations included Finland, Norway, Portugal, and Sweden, though all would subsequently return soon after. The 4-way win was historic and controversial for Eurovision, and will always remain so. However, all 4 nations were granted a victory, even if it was shared with their competitors. For the Netherlands, it was 3rd time as champions, France one-upping them, becoming the first nation to win Eurovision 4 times. Spain also made history, as the first country to win twice in a row, and for the UK, it was their second victory in a matter of years, with Lulu's participation, song, and even her look representing a nice bookend to what had been a colourful, vibrant, and perhaps most poignantly, fun decade. Lulu was catapulted back into chart success once again. The song peaked at number 2 in the UK, giving Lulu her highest charting hit single so far, and across Europe, that success was replicated in several territories. Boom Banga Bang went top 10 in countries such as Finland, Denmark, Belgium, and Switzerland, even peaking at number 1 in Norway, giving the young star another international chart topper. Lulu continued to be a regular face on British TV throughout the 1970s and did release new music regularly as well. In 1974, The Man Who Sold the World would reach number 3, her highest charting entry since winning Eurovision. That same year, she joined a small group of artists who have contributed theme songs to the James Bond film series. The Man with the Golden Gun, Roger Moore's second outing as 007, is a fine film, with Christopher Lee as the villainous Scaramanga. But sadly for Lulu, the theme failed to chart in most territories, though it is looked back on with a lot more fondness today. The 1980s were less kind to the Scottish singer in terms of chart success, with only one top 10 entry, that itself being a re-recording of her debut single Shout in 1986. However, the 90s would see a kind of Lulu resurgence. She narrowly missed the top 10 with her 1993 single Independence, but would finally top the UK charts that same year. This was done in collaboration with the hottest boy band of the era, Take That. Relight My Fire had been a hit for Dan Hartman during the disco boom of the late 70s, but together with Take That, Lulu was able to take it to number 1, finally achieving a UK chart topper after nearly 30 years in the business. She continued to release new music as the years went on, and can still be seen popping up here and there on television. Her last top 10 entry was in 2002, with the song We've Got Tonight, a duet with Westlife's Ronan Keating. The 1969 Eurovision Song Contest is one that is often remembered by avid fans. The controversy, the drama, the repercussions, it all makes for quite the fascinating story. But despite sharing the victory with 3 other nations, the UK had rounded off the 60s with another win. As the 1970s dawned, a new era for both the contest and the popular music scene as a whole was about to get underway. For those at the BBC who were in charge of submitting entries to the UK, they were wondering just how often, and to what extent, they could repeat these crowning glories with a bang. The year is 1976, and the 21st Eurovision Song Contest took place in The Hague, Netherlands, on the 3rd of April 1976. 18 different nations took part, all of whom had been part of the contest at some point beforehand. 2 of them, Austria and Greece, were returning after being absent. 3 previous participating nations didn't take part in 1976, these being Turkey, Malta, and surprisingly, Sweden. This was partly due to financial pressures of hosting the contest should they win, but also some public demonstrations against it too. During the first half of the 1970s, the United Kingdom had seen mixed results at Eurovision. A whole manner of artists took turns in representing the UK, including the New Seekers, Olivia Newton-John, and former Eurovision runner-up, Cliff Richard. Between 1969 and 1976, the UK always managed to place within the top 5, even finishing second on 3 of those occasions. But after the Shadows secured the UK's 9th silver medal in 1975, it was time for things to change. An act would be required to not only embody some of the most popular sounds of the day, but one that would give the United Kingdom its first much desired win at Eurovision during the 1970s. And whereas the previous two winners had been soloists, for the 1976 contest, the chosen artist would be a group. Brotherhood of Man was first created back in 1969 by songwriter and record producer Tony Hiller. For the first few years of its existence, the name reflected an ever-rotating group of session singers. They achieved one big hit, United We Stand, which reached the top 10 in the UK and even top 20 in the US, but by 1973, a definitive lineup was brought in, comprised of Martyn Lee Sheridan, Nikki Stevens, and Sandra Stevens. Despite Brotherhood of Man now having some artist consistency, they were struggling to break into the UK charts once again. They had some success across Europe, however, which saw their 1975 single, Kiss Me, Kiss Your Baby, reach the top 10 in several territories, even topping the charts in Belgium. In an attempt to rectify the situation at home, Hiller submitted one of their new songs for that year's A Song for Europe, the programme at that time responsible for choosing the UK's Eurovision entry. Hiller's timing was quite apt, as 1976 marked the first year in which more than one artist would be performing the contending songs. Winning by just 2 points, the song, Save Your Kisses for Me, would be representing the UK at Eurovision 1976. It was released as a single some weeks before the contest and raced to number 1 even before the programme was broadcast, giving Brotherhood of Man their first chart topper. By the night of the 1976 contest, Brotherhood of Man took to the stage in The Hague, performing first out of 18 acts. Some would say this is bad luck, as by the end of the evening some may have forgotten the earlier performances. This was certainly not the case in 1976. Despite going first, Brotherhood of Man took first place by 17 points, receiving the maximum 12 from 7 different countries. Statistically speaking, under the 12 points voting system, first introduced the year before in 1975, Brotherhood of Man are the most successful Eurovision winner by points allocated, achieving just over 80% of what at that time could have been the maximum score. Now, that certainly is impressive, and as a relief for all involved, there were no tiebreakers, no last-minute adjustments. The UK won fair and square, their third victory overall, and their first in 7 years. Whilst those at the BBC now focused on how to host Eurovision for the 1977 contest, for Brotherhood of Man, it was only just the beginning. Save Your Kisses for Me, whether you love it or hate it, is more than just a Eurovision winner. It stayed atop the UK charts for 6 weeks, and ultimately became the best-selling single of the year. Overall, it sold around 6 million copies, still making it to this day the highest-selling Eurovision single of all time. And if any feared that Brotherhood of Man wouldn't top the charts again, those fears were brushed aside when the following year, in 1977, they topped the charts with Angelo. Some say this is nothing more than a rip-off of Fernando, another big hit single performed by fellow Eurovision winners, ABBA. But music's subjective, so I'll let you be the judge of that. In 1978, they would top the charts for a third and final time, with their single, Figaro. Anyone else starting to notice a little bit of a pattern here? However, as the 70s became the 80s, Brotherhood of Man struggled to adapt and remain successful in the ever-shifting music landscape. A new, more up-to-date sound was attempted, but the only single of the 80s to even scrape the charts was Lightning Flash, managing a lousy 67th place in 1982. However, despite their period of UK chart success being brief, they continued to perform and tour throughout the 80s, 90s, and even into the 21st century. They retained a loyal and devoted following, and only recently announced their retirement from touring during the winter of 2022. Eurovision 1976 is historical for its winner. Brotherhood of Man not only secured the UK their third victory at the contest, but it became the event's biggest and best-selling single, an achievement that still stands almost 50 years later. Some throw this single away as being nothing more than a piece of cheesy drivel, but really, when you break it down, it's a pop song that clearly resonated with millions, not just in the UK, but across the entire European continent. So whilst Brotherhood of Man weren't able to sustain their success beyond the 1970s, they will always be remembered for this historic, record-breaking Eurovision victory. The year is 1981, and the 26th Eurovision Song Contest took place in Dublin, Ireland, on the 4th of April 1981. 20 different nations took part, all of whom had been part of the contest at some point beforehand, except for Cyprus, this year marking their Eurovision debut. Israel and Yugoslavia, as it was then, returned after respective absences, though Italy and Morocco withdrew, the latter never returning to Eurovision, with 1980 marking their one and only appearance at the contest. Following Brotherhood of Man's victory in 1976, the United Kingdom's standing at Eurovision continued to remain generally strong. The following year would see another second-place finish for Lindsay DePaul and Mike Moran, an 11th place finish for Coco in 1978, the first time the UK had ever finished outside the top 10. 1979 would see Black Lace finish 7th with Mary Ann, and yes, that's the same Black Lace that made... 1980 saw fortunes turn a little, with Prima Donna taking home bronze with the track Love Enough for Two. But to claim victory, another group would be selected to represent the UK, perhaps employing a bit more style tactics to try and win over European audiences. Bucks Fizz were a group thrown together in early 1981, with the sole intention of competing at the Eurovision Song Contest. The lineup comprised of Bobby G, Cheryl Baker, Mike Nolan, and Jay Aston, and with their voices blending well, their song, Making Your Mind Up, was submitted for the annual A Song for Europe. Competition was tough, coming from acts such as Liquid Gold. Ultimately, however, they came out the victors, and would travel to Dublin to represent the UK in the 1981 contest. Making Your Mind Up was released as a single in the UK, and slowly began to climb the charts. But whilst things were looking positive for the quartet, their arrival into Ireland came at a time of extreme tension. The Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, were arguably at the peak of their notoriety by the turn of the 1980s. Throughout the previous decade, there had been mass disruption and violence throughout Ireland as a whole, with those part of the army seeking to reunify Ireland and have it as its own independent nation, free from the constraints of the United Kingdom. This era of conflict was and still is known as the Troubles, with the ramifications of it still being felt across Ireland today. Back in 1981, as Dublin was gearing up to host Eurovision, security was strengthened to its maximum. More than 250 armed soldiers and police were on duty, aiming to prevent any kind of protest or violence during the run of the contest. For Bucks Fizz, being as they represented the United Kingdom, they were placed under constant guard during their time in Ireland, for fear that they would be specifically targeted by the IRA. Though thankfully no such conflict did break out, though the hotel at which participants were staying at was evacuated due to a bomb scare. Performing 14th out of 20 nations, Bucks Fizz were already tipped as the favourites to win amongst those who were participating. Their performance definitely went some ways to help achieve this victory. The song on its own is catchy, upbeat, something you can dance and sing along to with relative ease. When watching it in person or on TV, however, how can you not forget those multicoloured outfits? And perhaps most notably, the moment that Eurovision fans still talk about, the skirt rip. When viewed with modern eyes, some may call out this move for being a bit crass and lowbrow, but even some commentators back in 1981 cited it as cheap. But the skirt rip is one of the most well-remembered Eurovision moments in its more than 60 years of history, with Making Your Mind Up also being one of the most well-remembered songs. When it came down to the voting, it was one of the closest that the contest had seen up until that point. France took an early lead, before host Ireland claimed pole position, but the main battle eventually fell between Switzerland, Germany, and the UK, each of them taking turns to hold the leading spot. With Sweden casting the final votes, the UK was able to take the win by just 4 points, the closest under the 12-point scoring system at that time. So Bucks Fizz had done it. Their formation to compete at the contest had resulted in a victory, the United Kingdom's 4th. However, not every European nation was thrilled with the result, and the group's performance would generate anger and spite. France's broadcaster would announce that they would not compete at the 1982 contest, claiming the songs were a monument to drivel, some arguing that this was a sly swipe at Bucks Fizz. But despite the criticism, the win couldn't be taken away from them. But upon returning home to the UK, now was the time for Bucks Fizz to build upon their success. And boy, build upon it they did. Making Your Mind Up eventually topped the UK charts, becoming the 7th best-selling single of 1981. With their debut album coming shortly afterwards, further singles were released to build on their ever-quickening rising profile. Piece of the Action took them to number 12, whilst one of those nights just scraped into the top 20. However, all was not lost, as the leading single from their second album, The Land of Make Believe, would take them right back to number 1. The next single, My Camera Never Lies, also peaked at number 1, giving Bucks Fizz 3 chart toppers in the space of just 1 year. More successful singles and albums would follow, including the top 10 hits Now Those Days Are Gone, If You Can't Stand the Heat, When We Were Young, and New Beginning. The latter was their last top 10 single, as by the second half of the 80s, their time in the mainstream seemed to be fading fast. Follow-up records started to miss the top 40 altogether, and their final single of the decade, You Love Love, failed to chart whatsoever. The group had also undergone some very tough events during the peak of their success. On the 11th of December, 1984, after performing to a sold-out crowd in Newcastle, Bucks Fizz, together with several members of their touring crew, were involved in a major crash. Their tour bus collided with an articulated lorry, resulting in extensive damage to both vehicles and the people on board. Thankfully, no one was killed, but several crew members, including the 4 members of Bucks Fizz, suffered extreme injuries. Bobby G perhaps came away the least damaged, being treated for whiplash. The severity increased with Jay Aston, who was treated for back injuries and severe head pains. Cheryl Baker's injuries are even more threatening, as she broke 3 vertebrae in her spine. But the most injured of them was undoubtedly Mike Nolan. His head was suffering from internal bleeding, so much so that the singer fell into a coma, one in which he would remain for several days. Whilst fans of Bucks Fizz and the British press kept an eager ear out for updates, at one time it seemed as if the worst had occurred. Whilst on the operating table, it was reported that Mike had in fact died, but upon having surgery and being placed on a life support machine, he ultimately did come through, though his condition remained critical whilst he was in the coma. Finally, on the 15th of December, he awoke, reportedly saying, "I'm alright," to the joyous reactions from family, friends, his bandmates, and the many fans that they had too. Though Mike had survived, there were long-lasting impacts to his health, including epilepsy, short-term memory loss, and a 50% loss of vision in not one but both of his eyes. Despite having a close encounter with death itself, Bucks Fizz continued on, though their appearances on the charts were growing less and less frequent. In 1985, Jay Aston left the group in not the quietest of manners, citing that she simply could no longer continue selling her story to the newspapers, who gleefully lapped up as much drama as they could from the group. The lineup for Bucks Fizz continued to change as the years and the decades wore on, and it seemed that by the late 1990s, any sort of success the group may have once had was now unattainable going into the 21st century. However, like with many acts of the era, Bucks Fizz has seen a period of resurgence and popularity in recent years. Despite the renewed interest, the lineup isn't as it always used to be. Bobby G, together with an ever-changing lineup of people, still perform under the moniker of Bucks Fizz. For Cheryl, Mike and Jay, however, they instead relaunched as simply The Fizz, and have released several albums under that name, some of them even making their way into the top 40. Their hit singles from the 80s are still well loved by tons of fans, and their following has remained consistent enough for both iterations to continue performing and releasing new material. The 1981 Eurovision Song Contest is mostly remembered for Bucks Fizz's performance, and whether you loved or hated it, it has cemented itself as one of the most iconic parts of Eurovision's long and distinguished history. For better or worse, Making Your Mind Up is one of those songs from the contest that will be around forever, and perhaps most importantly, for the UK's history at the event, it gave them their 4th victory. Not many nations have been able to win even once, let alone 4 times, but as the time between victories grew longer, it seemed that with an ever-growing lineup of nations who wanted to participate, that the United Kingdom's chances of taking home the trophy again were next to none. But we would win once more, at a contest taking place once again in Dublin, Ireland. The year is 1997, and the 42nd Eurovision Song Contest took place in Dublin, Ireland on the 3rd of May 1997. 25 different nations took part, all of whom had been part of the contest at some point beforehand. Due to the regulation system in place at the time, several nations were returning to the contest after a year's absence. Countries such as Denmark, Germany, Hungary, Italy and Russia all took part once more, whereas under these regulation rules, Belgium, Finland and Slovakia sat the 1997 contest out. Since its last victory in 1981, the United Kingdom's standing at Eurovision began to waver as the 80s and 90s trundled on. There were still many occasions where the UK finished second, 4 of them in fact, with Scott Fitzgerald, Live Report, Michael Ball and Sonia all receiving silver medals. But more and more often, the UK was finishing outside of the top 5 or even the top 10 in some cases. After finishing 8th with Gina G's dance floor banger Ooh Ah Just a Little Bit in 1996, the UK selection for 1997 would be what some would see as a rather unorthodox choice. Whereas Bucks Fizz had been formed with the purpose of competing in Eurovision, Katrina and the Waves had been around for 20 years before they even considered taking part in the contest. Originally known as simply The Waves, the band first formed and played in the mid to late 70s, before rebranding as Mama's Cookin', playing covers of American hits to a steadily growing audience. Under Mama's Cookin', American singer Katrina Lescanich was brought in as the lead singer, belting out covers of hit songs by acts such as Foreigner, Linda Ronstadt, and ZZ Top to name a few. After rebranding back to The Waves during the early 80s, the name Katrina and the Waves would arrive in 1983, with Katrina herself still being the primary vocalist. Their first major, and still arguably biggest hit, came in 1985, with the summery, positively charged bop, Walking on Sunshine. The song was a smash, reaching the top 10 in both the UK and the US. Oddly, they weren't able to follow up Sunshine with another hit single to the same degree. They kept making music, gaining a big loyal following around Europe and Canada, though for over a decade here in the UK, they weren't able to chart within the top 40. All of that would change during 1997. With a profile mainly steeped in rock music, some may wonder how Katrina and the Waves came to represent the UK at Eurovision. The song they played, Love Shine a Light, was originally born from a request. The brother of the group's drummer, Alex Cooper, was a member of the Swindon branch of the Samaritans organisation. Requesting a song to be a sort of anthem for the Samaritans and the work they do, regular songwriter and guitarist for the band, Kimberly Rue, got to work on the track. However, upon hearing it, Samaritan members commented that Love Shine a Light was the kind of tune that could win Eurovision, so in a frantic scramble, the group submitted it to the preliminary selection programme, the Great British Song Contest. Easily winning that selection process, beating the runner-up by more than 11,000 votes, Katrina and the Waves were set to take the stage in Dublin, performing second to last out of 25 competing countries. On the night of the 1997 contest, taking place on the 3rd of May, Katrina and the Waves raced to victory, beating runners-up Ireland by more than 70 points, preventing them from achieving a record-breaking 8th win. Whilst the simple performance setup resonated with European audiences around the world, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the lead songwriter and guitarist for the band, Kimberly Rue, isn't there, because he isn't. Despite doing promotional appearances following Love Shine a Light's selection as the UK representative, Rue disassociated himself from the contest and the band for a time following their involvement. Despite him not being present in Dublin, this didn't seem to hamper the performance all that much, and as the band claimed the trophy, they had also claimed the United Kingdom their 5th Eurovision Song Contest victory. The win wasn't without some controversy, however. With Katrina herself being an American national, there were some calls that a British singer should have been chosen instead. This seems a hilarious criticism these days, as several artists who take to the Eurovision stage represent countries that they aren't a national of. Katrina herself didn't seem too fazed by these criticisms, though she did mention that she had been asked, presumably by UK delegates involved in the contest, if she could try and talk like an English person, which is a very British request all by itself. Winning Eurovision 1997 gave Katrina and the Waves their most successful chart single to date, as Love Shine a Light peaked at number 3. However, like many a Eurovision act before them, that success wasn't to be sustained. Follow-up singles failed to chart, and just 1 year later in 1998, Katrina left entirely, citing disagreements within the band. The remaining members desperately tried to find a new Katrina to replace their lead singer, though in the end, the band did dissolve in 1999, all of them pursuing individual careers. Katrina, though prevented from using the band's famous name, still performs around the world. She also pops up on Eurovision-related programs and events, seemingly proud and happy to showcase her contribution to the contest.
Shine a light in every corner of our hearts.
5-time champions across 4 different decades. The UK's history at Eurovision is certainly one littered with highs, lows, and everything in between. If you can take away one thing from these victories, it's that the songs and artists definitely represent the era in which they came. Sandie Shaw and Lulu represent the fun, free spirit of the 1960s. Brotherhood of Man and Buck's Fizz embody the more laid-back, cheesy style of pop that was present in the late 70s and early 80s. And for Katrina and the Waves, their song embodies the anthemic bangers that were oh so popular in the late 90s. All 5 winners hold their place in Eurovision and music history as a whole. You may like or dislike these songs and performers, but as far as the UK is concerned, without them, we wouldn't have seen the success at Eurovision that we've had across the last near 7 decades. The United Kingdom stands with 5 total wins at Eurovision. Over 25 years later, we sadly haven't yet seen a 6th victory. We came tantalisingly close during the 2022 contest in Turin, Italy, where Sam Ryder took 2nd place. So, will 2023 be the year? Will Mae Muller break the 25-year drought? Only time will tell, and if you're watching this after the contest, then you'll undoubtedly already know the answer.
Instead I wrote a song